I was drinking my morning coffee in my pajamas when I saw a woman with a measuring tape standing in my driveway, acting like she owned the place. That woman was Linda, our HOA president, and she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. "Your driveway is 18 inches too wide," she announced like she was delivering breaking news. "You have 30 days to fix it or pay a $12,000 fine." I almost choked on my coffee. $12,000? For what? My driveway looked exactly like every other driveway on the street. But Linda wasn't done with her little power trip. "And if you can't pay," she said with a smile that made my skin crawl, "I know some investors who might be interested in buying your house." That's when I knew this wasn't about my driveway. This was about something much bigger. And by the end of this story, Linda would learn that messing with the wrong person can cost you everything. Before you watch complete story, comment down from which country are you watching. Also subscribe the channel. Let me tell you about Sunset Valley, our neighborhood of 52 houses where everyone pays $180 a month in HOA fees so someone can tell them what color to paint their fence. I bought my house 8 months ago, thinking I was living the American dream. What I didn't know was that Linda Parker had been HOA president for 3 years, and she had a reputation for finding problems where none existed. Standing there in my pajamas, coffee mug in hand, I tried to stay calm. "Can I see the exact rule you're talking about?" I asked. Linda's smile got even more fake. "I'll email you all the paperwork," she said, which basically meant, "I don't have it with me right now." Red flag number 1. Then I noticed something weird. She measured the same spot 3 times and got 3 different numbers. For someone who was supposedly documenting a precise violation, she wasn't being very precise. Red flag number 2. As Linda packed up her measuring tape with the satisfaction of someone who just solved world hunger, I made a decision. Instead of panicking or calling a lawyer, I was going to treat this like any other problem that needed solving. Step 1. Get my hands on every HOA document that existed. Linda gave me 30 days to comply, but she had no idea she just handed me 30 days to investigate every aspect of her claims, her authority, and the legal foundation of everything she was trying to do. As I watched her walk away, I couldn't help but smile. She thought she was hunting me, but she just triggered someone who doesn't give up easily. 3 days later, I got a certified mail package that felt like a legal bomb. The violation notice was written in aggressive language that made it sound like I'd committed a federal crime instead of just parking my car in my own driveway. But here's where it got interesting. The notice cited Section 5.3.8 of the HOA rules, but when I checked my copy, it only went up to Section 5.3.7. Either my copy was missing pages or someone was making up rules. I called my friend Jessica, who works in city planning. "Hey Jess, weird question, but can HOA rules make something illegal that was legal when it was built?" Her answer was like finding gold. "Absolutely not. That's called grandfathering, and it's basic property law. You can't make legal buildings non-compliant after the fact." For the first time since Linda's ambush, I felt like I had a fighting chance. Saturday morning, while getting my mail, my neighbor Tom walked over with a serious look. Tom's a retired police officer, so when he looks serious, you listen. "Hey, you dealing with Linda's driveway nonsense?" he asked. When I nodded, his face got dark. "She pulled this exact same trick on the Williams family last year and the Chin family the year before." The word trick hit me like lightning. This wasn't just about my driveway. This was a pattern. Tom introduced me to both families, and their stories were almost identical to mine. The Williams got hit with a fence violation that supposedly broke safety rules that didn't exist when they built their fence. The Chens were told their mailbox was the wrong color, even though it matched 5 other mailboxes on the street. In both cases, Linda escalated from friendly reminders to formal violations to threats of daily fines. She created so much stress that both families seriously considered selling their houses. And here's the scary part. In both cases, Linda casually mentioned knowing investors who might be interested in their properties. Both families ended up spending thousands of dollars on unnecessary fixes rather than fight the daily fines. But they still lived in the neighborhood and they were angry. I started doing some detective work on Linda's social media. Her community page showed a clear pattern of targeting specific houses, always with the same language about protecting property values and maintaining community standards. What was suspicious was that the same 3 accounts always agreed with her enforcement actions. Like she had a small group of supporters who never questioned anything she did. Looking at her post history, I could see she'd been documenting violations for years, and many of the targeted houses had eventually gone up for sale. Then I did some research on Linda herself. She'd bought her house in 2021 after what looked like a messy divorce. There were hints online of money problems, late payments, high debt, the kind of financial stress that might drive someone to desperate measures. Her real estate license was active, but public records showed very few recent sales. The picture was starting to come together. Linda needed commission money from property sales, and she was creating fake pressure to force families to sell, probably to investors who were giving her a cut. Tom shared some wisdom that stuck with me. I've dealt with bullies for 30 years and they all have the same weakness. They think everyone else is too scared to fight back. The question is, are you going to be scared or are you going to fight? His words hit different because they came from someone who'd seen real danger. This wasn't just about my driveway anymore. This was about standing up to someone who was terrorizing families for profit. The breakthrough came when Jessica sent me property survey maps from the city planning office. The original maps from when our neighborhood was built showed my driveway as standard width per city code. And the current city code still allowed my exact width. This meant Linda's HOA rules directly conflicted with actual city rules, which gave her zero legal authority to enforce them. But as I studied those old maps more carefully, comparing them with current satellite images, I noticed something that made my heart race. The public road that everyone used to get to the neighborhood might not actually be as public as everyone thought. Linda's next move came exactly 1 week after our first meeting, and it was designed to turn the entire neighborhood against me. She created a newsletter with a dramatic headline, "Protecting Our Standards, The Driveway Crisis." The newsletter had photos of my house and scary warnings about property values. She made it sound like I was single-handedly destroying the neighborhood by refusing to comply with reasonable requests. She scheduled a community meeting at the local library, advertising it as an urgent discussion about problem residents who were threatening everyone's investments. The community meeting was an ambush designed to embarrass me with social pressure. 40 residents packed into the library meeting room on a Tuesday evening, and Linda had prepared a full PowerPoint presentation about property values and community compliance. She painted me as a troublemaker who was refusing reasonable cooperation, using emotional manipulation to suggest that my resistance would somehow lead to neighborhood chaos. "Do we want our neighborhood to become a place where anything goes?" she asked dramatically, as if my driveway width was the first step toward complete anarchy. When Linda finished her presentation, I asked for speaking time. The room got uncomfortably quiet. I'd prepared materials, but standing in front of 40 neighbors felt like being on trial. I presented the timeline calmly. My driveway was legal when it was built. Existing structures are protected from rule changes after the fact. And the original HOA rules actually allowed my driveway width. Then I dropped my first bomb. "Linda, when exactly did you inform residents about these rule changes that supposedly affect existing structures?" The question hit her like a slap. She hadn't expected me to have done research, let alone come prepared with actual legal principles. Linda's composure cracked for the first time. She stumbled over dates, contradicted statements she'd made minutes earlier, and got increasingly defensive. "The board has the right to interpret rules as needed to protect community standards," she finally said, which wasn't actually an answer to my question. I watched several residents exchange glances. I could see doubt being planted in their minds. Maybe I wasn't the unreasonable troublemaker Linda had painted me to be. The following week, Linda hired what she called an independent surveyor, though it was obvious this guy was anything but independent. He showed up at my house unannounced, demanding immediate access to my property. I politely refused, explaining that he needed to schedule through proper channels. That's when he made a mistake that changed everything. "Look man, the lady just wants documentation of the violation. Can't you just let me do my job?" He'd accidentally admitted that his job wasn't to measure accurately, but to find evidence supporting a predetermined conclusion. Linda's desperation became clear when she tried to attack my workplace. She'd somehow found out where I worked and called my boss, claiming I was a disruptive employee whose behavior was affecting community safety. My boss called me later, laughing about the whole thing. "Dude, your neighbor called to complain about you. She said you were threatening community stability or something crazy. I told her you work from home and barely talk to anyone. She's completely nuts." That's when I started recording all our interactions, which was completely legal in our state. The recordings were revealing. I captured Linda's surveyor admitting that Mrs. Parker told me exactly what to find. Tom witnessed and photographed Linda doing daily drive-bys of my property, taking pictures of my car, my yard, even my trash cans, like she was building some kind of case against me. Things got stranger when Linda called an emergency HOA board meeting about what she claimed were my safety concerns and threats. She told the board I'd exhibited threatening behavior, but when pressed for specifics, she couldn't provide any evidence. The other board members were confused because no one had witnessed anything I'd supposedly done. Sarah Wilson, who'd been on the board for 5 years, later told me privately that she'd never seen Linda act so strangely. While Linda was busy trying to destroy my reputation, I was building the case that would ultimately destroy hers. Jessica had sent me complete property records going back to the 1950s, before our neighborhood was even developed. Hidden in those old farm surveys was information that would change everything. The original farm property lines ran directly through what was now our public road. According to the historical documents, portions of the road that everyone used might still legally belong to the original property owners. And based on the property descriptions in my deed, my lot appeared to include 12 feet of what everyone assumed was public roadway. The implications were huge. If I was right about the property lines, I might not just own my driveway, I might legally control access to the entire neighborhood. I spent hours double-checking the surveys, cross-referencing property descriptions, and researching property law online. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The city had built our road on private property and simply assumed they had permission, but no formal agreement had ever been filed. Linda thought she could intimidate me with lawyers and surveyors and community pressure. But she just made one fatal mistake. She'd escalated this beyond HOA authority into real legal territory, and I was about to show her what happens when you bring a knife to a nuclear war. Linda's desperation reached new heights when she decided to involve the police. She filed a report claiming I was stalking and harassing her, complete with what she claimed was evidence of threatening behavior. The accusations were completely made up, but they were serious enough to force me into court to defend myself against a restraining order request. Standing in that courthouse, listening to Linda's lawyer read a list of things I'd supposedly done, felt surreal. According to her version, I was some kind of dangerous stalker who'd been terrorizing her for weeks. The reality was that she'd started every single interaction between us, but now she was painting herself as the victim. Fortunately, I'd been documenting everything since our first encounter. I arrived at court with an organized binder of evidence that told the real story. I presented a clear timeline showing that Linda had started all contact and escalation, including the recordings of her surveyor admitting bias and predetermined conclusions. The judge was visibly annoyed as the facts came out, especially when it became clear that Linda's evidence was either taken out of context or completely fabricated. "Mrs. Parker," the judge finally said, "this appears to be purely retaliatory, and I'm concerned about the resources you're wasting with frivolous filings." The restraining order was dismissed, meaning Linda couldn't try again. I walked out of that courthouse with official validation of my right to investigate property boundaries. With the court's blessing, I hired a legitimate surveyor recommended by the courthouse staff. His findings confirmed my suspicions in the most dramatic way possible. The official survey showed that I owned a 12-foot strip of what everyone considered public roadway. More importantly, when we searched city records for the formal permission agreement that should have existed for road usage, we found nothing. No easement, no right-of-way agreement, no legal documentation giving the city permission to build a road on private property. It was the kind of bureaucratic oversight that happens when small towns grow quickly and assume paperwork exists when it doesn't. Linda's response to losing in court was to have a very public meltdown on social media. She went live on her community page ranting about the corrupt system, protecting troublemakers, and how she'd worked too hard building property values to let one selfish person ruin everything. In her anger, she accidentally revealed her true motivation. This was never about community standards or property values. This was about her personal need to control the neighborhood for her own benefit. The comments on her live stream showed that neighbors were increasingly critical of her behavior, with several people pointing out that she seemed more interested in causing drama than solving problems. The city got involved when their engineer arrived to investigate the road ownership issue that Linda's complaints had accidentally triggered. The engineer confirmed what the surveyor had found. The city had assumed permission to use the road but had never formalized any legal agreement. "This is a complex property rights issue that requires immediate resolution," he told me, which was bureaucratic speak for, "Someone screwed up decades ago and now we have to fix it." Linda panicked when she realized her harassment campaign had triggered an official investigation that threatened the very road access she was trying to protect. The community began turning against Linda when Tom organized an informal neighborhood coffee gathering where previous victims of her harassment finally shared their stories publicly. The Williams family described how Linda had terrorized them over fence height until they spent $4,000 on unnecessary modifications. The Chens explained how they'd been forced to repaint their mailbox and install new landscaping to avoid daily fines for violations that existed only in Linda's imagination. A clear pattern emerged. Linda had systematically targeted families for personal profit, using HOA authority to create fake crises that pressured people into selling their homes below market value. Armed with legal validation and community support, I filed a formal application with the city to control access to my portion of the road. The application was completely legal under property rights law, and the city approved my permits pending a community impact assessment. I ordered professional signs reading "Private Property Owner Permission Required," and installed temporary orange traffic barriers marking the exact boundary where my property began. Everything was completely legal, properly permitted, and absolutely devastating to Linda's plans. For the first time since this whole mess started, I held all the cards. The psychological victory was immediate and overwhelming. Linda realized she'd created her own trap by escalating a simple driveway dispute into a legal battle that exposed her vulnerability. Her harassment campaign had triggered the exact legal review that revealed my control over neighborhood access. The roles had completely reversed. Instead of me being the victim of her pressure campaign, she was now at the mercy of my property rights. I had legal authority, community support, and the moral high ground, while she had nothing but a history of bullying and a restraining order that had been dismissed as frivolous. The final community meeting that Linda called about the road access crisis drew the largest neighborhood turnout in years. 50-plus residents packed the library on a Wednesday evening, drawn by rumors and social media posts about the drama. Linda arrived overdressed in a formal blazer and fake jewelry, looking like she was heading to a job interview rather than a neighborhood meeting. Her entire appearance screamed authority figure, but the desperate energy radiating from her suggested she knew this might be her last performance as the neighborhood's self-appointed queen. Linda's presentation was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She painted me as an outside agitator threatening our neighborhood way of life, someone who'd moved in and immediately started causing problems for long-established community standards. She claimed that the road closure would destroy everyone's property values and called for community action to preserve established standards against troublemakers. It was a polished performance designed to make the audience forget that she was the one who'd started this entire conflict. When residents started asking specific questions about the road ownership claims, Linda's polish began to crack. She dodged questions with vague legal-sounding nonsense, got increasingly defensive when pressed for details, and made the fatal mistake of letting her true feelings show. "Some people just don't belong in established communities like ours," she said, and the room went quiet. It was the kind of statement that revealed exactly what she thought about newcomers, outsiders, and anyone who dared question her authority. When I requested speaking time, I kept my approach simple. Just present the facts chronologically without emotion or drama. I explained the timeline of Linda's harassment, the false legal claims she'd made against me, the court's dismissal of her restraining order attempt, and the subsequent discovery of the property ownership issue. "I never wanted any of this," I told the room honestly. "I just wanted to live peacefully in my house." The contrast between my calm presentation and Linda's theatrical performance was stark, and I could see people beginning to reassess everything they'd been told. The evidence reveal was devastating. I played the recording of Linda's surveyor admitting that he'd been told what to find rather than conducting an honest assessment. I showed the court documents dismissing her restraining order as frivolous and retaliatory. I presented the official survey confirming my ownership of part of the road, and finished with the city engineer's written confirmation that no legal permission agreement existed for road usage. Each piece of evidence built on the previous one, creating an undeniable picture of Linda's harassment campaign and the legal realities she tried to hide from everyone. The community revelation that followed was like watching dominoes fall. The Williams family stood up to describe their experience with Linda's harassment over fence regulations that didn't exist when they built their fence. The Chens detailed how they'd been forced to spend thousands of dollars on unnecessary modifications to avoid daily fines for made-up violations. Other residents began sharing their own stories of interactions with Linda that had seemed suspicious at the time but made perfect sense now. A clear pattern emerged of systematic targeting, fake crisis creation, and abuse of HOA authority for personal financial gain. Linda's complete breakdown was painful to watch but necessary for the community to see. When challenged by multiple neighbors about her tactics and motivations, she lost all composure and started screaming about ungrateful neighbors and property value destruction. She blamed everyone, the city, the courts, troublemakers like me, and even her own board members for not supporting her vision of community leadership. It was a public display of exactly the kind of unstable, vindictive personality that had been hiding behind her professional facade for years. The HOA board revolt was swift and decisive. Sarah Wilson, who'd served on the board for 5 years, stood up during Linda's meltdown and said, "Linda, we need to discuss your leadership immediately. Private property owner permission required for access." Linda was literally trapped in her house, unable to legally leave without asking permission from the person she'd spent weeks trying to destroy. I graciously granted access to every neighbor who asked, but Linda had to call me on the phone for permission to leave her own property. The role reversal was complete. The former victim now held absolute power over his former tormentor, and the entire neighborhood witnessed the consequences of choosing bullying over community cooperation. The phone call came on a Friday evening, 3 days after Linda had been stripped of her HOA presidency and trapped behind my legal road closure. Her voice was barely recognizable. Gone was the authoritative tone that had defined her interactions with everyone in the neighborhood. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. "Can you please come over?" The word please, coming from Linda, was like hearing a foreign language. But I agreed to meet at my house, where the power dynamic would be crystal clear. When she arrived an hour later, she looked like a completely different person than the woman who'd measured my driveway 6 weeks earlier. Linda's appearance told the story of her complete defeat better than any words could have. Her expensive blazer was wrinkled. Her makeup was smeared from crying. And the fake designer jewelry that had been part of her authority costume looked cheap and desperate. She sat on my couch like a job applicant who knew they weren't getting hired, clutching a folder of papers that probably contained all the legal documents she should have read before starting this war. "I need to explain what really happened," she began. And for the first time since I'd known her, Linda was telling the truth about something. The financial desperation behind her harassment campaign was worse than I'd imagined. She was behind on her mortgage, drowning in credit card debt from her divorce, and facing foreclosure. Her real estate license wasn't enough to cover her growing financial collapse. "I thought if I could force a few sales in the neighborhood, get some commission from helping families relocate, I could get back on my feet financially," she admitted. It was a confession that revealed the calculated nature of every violation she'd found, every family she'd terrorized, every friendship she'd destroyed in pursuit of money. The scheme was more sophisticated than simple harassment. Linda had developed relationships with several real estate investors who specialized in below-market purchases from distressed sellers. She would create artificial pressure through HOA violations and daily fines, making families feel like they had no choice but to sell quickly to avoid mounting costs. The investors would swoop in with cash offers at 10 to 15% below market value, and Linda would earn referral fees for bringing them the deals. The Williams family, the Chens, and at least 2 other families had been victims of this system, losing tens of thousands of dollars on their home sales because of pressure that Linda had deliberately created. My terms for resolving the situation were designed to ensure justice while protecting the community from future abuse. First, Linda would make a public apology at a community meeting, specifically acknowledging her harassment campaign and abuse of HOA authority. Second, she would pay restitution of $7,500 to cover my legal costs, survey expenses, and time lost dealing with her harassment. Third, she would accept a permanent ban from any HOA leadership position and sign a behavioral contract promising no further harassment of any neighborhood residents. Finally, she would complete 40 hours of community service helping elderly neighbors with yard work and home maintenance, supervised by Tom and the new HOA board. The road access negotiation was the key to long-term community protection. I offered to grant a permanent road usage agreement to the city, ensuring that everyone would have guaranteed access to their homes without depending on my continued goodwill. However, the agreement would include specific conditions: new HOA bylaws preventing selective rule enforcement, a protection clause allowing any resident to challenge violations with independent review, and a transparency requirement for all enforcement actions. The goal was to create a system where no future HOA leader could abuse their authority the way Linda had abused hers. The public apology ceremony took place 1 week later at another packed community meeting, but this time the energy was completely different. Instead of Linda's theatrical presentation designed to turn neighbors against each other, this was a moment of accountability and healing for the community. Linda read a prepared statement acknowledging her wrongdoing, specifically apologizing to the Williams family, the Chen family, and me for the harassment and financial harm she'd caused. "I abused my position as HOA president and harmed my neighbors for personal financial gain," she said, her voice breaking with emotion that seemed genuine for the first time since I'd known her. The community transformation that followed was remarkable to witness. Tom was elected as the new HOA president with unanimous support, and the focus immediately shifted from petty enforcement to actual community improvement. The new board established clear, fair rules that were consistently applied to everyone. And they organized the first neighborhood social events that had happened in years. Property values stabilized as word spread about the reasonable HOA governance that made Sunset Valley an attractive place to live rather than a place people wanted to escape from. The neighborhood had learned that community strength comes from cooperation and mutual respect, not from one person's desire to control everyone else. Linda's consequences extended far beyond the immediate situation. Her real estate license was suspended pending a state ethics review that would likely result in permanent revocation. The harassment and fraud complaints filed against her would follow her to any future employment in real estate or property management. Within 30 days of the public apology, she listed her house for sale and began planning to move out of state, unable to handle the continued embarrassment of facing neighbors she'd betrayed. The woman who had tried to force others from their homes was now fleeing her own, a victim of the very system she tried to exploit for profit. 6 months after Linda's final defeat, I was sitting on my front porch with my morning coffee when the mail carrier handed me an official-looking envelope from a law firm. My first thought was that some bureaucratic loose end needed tying up. But when I opened it, I found something that made me smile. Linda was filing a formal complaint challenging the city's determination that portions of our road were private property. Even in defeat, even after moving 200 miles away, she was still trying to overturn the very discovery that had ended her reign of terror. The letter felt like a last gasp from someone who couldn't accept that her victims had fought back and won. Sunset Valley had transformed from a neighborhood ruled by fear into a genuine community built on mutual respect and fair governance. Tom's leadership as HOA president was everything Linda had pretended to be: transparent, consistent, and focused on actually serving residents rather than controlling them. The monthly HOA meetings had become collaborative discussions about community improvement projects rather than kangaroo courts where residents were ambushed with surprise violations. Property values had not only stabilized but were actually increasing as word spread about our reasonable HOA governance that attracted families looking for a place to build a life rather than walk on eggshells. The impact of our fight reached beyond Sunset Valley. 2 nearby communities adopted our model with new transparency rules, and the city began reviewing other neighborhoods for similar legal land use issues before they spiraled into full-blown conflicts. My own transformation from quiet homeowner to community advocate had surprised everyone, including myself. The monthly property rights for normal people workshops I hosted had become popular enough to expand citywide, with requests from other communities facing HOA abuse. I'd helped 9 families resolve similar disputes through education about their legal rights rather than expensive court battles. My favorite success story was the Martinez family, whose HOA tried to force them to remove a wheelchair ramp that violated aesthetic standards. Armed with information about disability rights and proper legal procedures, they not only kept their ramp but got their HOA to apologize and pay for professional landscaping to integrate it beautifully with their home. Tom's mentorship had been crucial to my development as a community leader, and his leadership style became the model for what HOA governance should look like. He was elected for 2 consecutive terms with 0 harassment complaints filed during his entire tenure. His approach was simple: treat neighbors like family, enforce rules consistently and fairly, and remember that the goal is to build community rather than demonstrate power. The new community charter that emerged from our experience became a template for healthy HOA governance that other neighborhoods copied. The Sunset Valley Fair Housing Standards included transparency requirements for all enforcement actions, protection for existing structures from rule changes after the fact, an independent appeal process for any violation claims, and an annual education mandate about property rights. Most importantly, it established the principle that HOA authority exists to serve the community, not to give any individual power over their neighbors' lives. The property value vindication was particularly satisfying, given Linda's claims that my resistance would destroy everyone's investments. Professional appraisals showed that homes in Sunset Valley were now worth 4% more than comparable properties in other neighborhoods, specifically because of our reputation for fair governance practices. My own house had increased in value by $28,000 since I'd bought it, making it the best investment I'd ever made, even before considering the personal growth and community connections that came from standing up for what was right. The educational impact of our story reached beyond property rights into broader lessons about civic engagement and personal responsibility. I was featured in a property law textbook as a case study in effective self-advocacy in property rights disputes. Several law schools now use our situation to teach students about the importance of documentation, proper legal procedures, and community organizing. My unofficial motto became, Don't let official titles intimidate you from defending what's legally right, and it resonated with people facing all kinds of institutional bullying beyond just HOA conflicts. The personal satisfaction I felt wasn't about revenge or humiliation, though there had been justice in watching Linda face consequences for her actions. The real satisfaction came from knowing that I'd protected not just my own rights, but the rights of future residents who would never have to face the kind of harassment that had defined our neighborhood under Linda's rule. Every family that moved into Sunset Valley would inherit the protections and community spirit that had grown from standing up to one bully who thought her title gave her unlimited power over other people's lives. What I learned goes beyond HOA battles. Knowledge only matters when paired with courage, and justice only works when a community refuses to be silent. Power unchecked is temporary, but accountability, that's what lasts. If you're dealing with HOA harassment or any kind of neighborhood bullying, remember these key points. Document absolutely everything. Know your legal rights and don't be afraid to research them thoroughly. And never let anyone intimidate you from defending your home and your family. Your property deed and your legal rights are more powerful than anyone's attitude, official title, or attempts to pressure you into submission. Sometimes the quietest person in the room really does hold all the power, especially when they decide to use it for justice rather than personal gain. Standing up for yourself often means standing up for everyone who comes after you, and that's a responsibility worth taking seriously. Linda Parker thought she could steal my driveway and force me from my dream home. But she accidentally taught an entire community about the importance of standing up to bullies and protecting each other from abuse of power. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's making sure the harmful behavior never happens to anyone else again.